All right, we're going to go ahead and finish up our last section to wrap up our animal diversity topic. And the last group of organisms that we're going to go over are vertebrates. So this is just a very brief introduction into vertebrates and vertebrate diversity. Mostly we're going to be covering a single phyla. We're going to go over a bunch of subphylum and classes within Vertebrata. So the phylum is the phylum Chordata. It's the last animal phyla that we are going to be covering. And it's a very, very large group of organisms. At least they have a vast amount of diversity, shapes, sizes, etc. So going over our cladogram here, of course, we have our ancestral and derived traits. So we've been moving from the bottom left to the top right, becoming more and more derived. And so finally, we're going up this final branch, chordata. So some of the ancestral traits: true tissues, bilateral symmetry, complex organ systems, true coelomates. They are triploblastic, so they have those germ layers, and they have complete digestive systems. Derived traits for chordata include these four main derived traits, and these are four traits that I definitely want you to know. So we'll go over what each of these are, but the first one is pharyngeal gill slits, then the dorsal nerve cord, the notochord, and the postanal tail. So this is the last branch of our phylogenetic tree that we're going up, so chordata. And then if we're just looking at chordata, so ancestral chordates, we're going to be going over most of these different groups. Not all of them, but most of them we'll be going over. So here it is zoomed up. So we'll start off with the most basal of the groups, Urochordata, and then we'll work our way up. So again, this time, this one's positioned a little bit differently. So we're moving from the top left to the bottom right. And this is moving through evolutionary time. So as we move this way, we are becoming more and more derived. All right, so characteristics, chordate traits. The dorsal nerve cord, this is eventually going to differentiate into the brain and spinal cord. So if we're looking here on our diagram, our dorsal nerve cord here is called the hollow dorsal nerve cord. It's in blue. And you can kind of see that it already is looking like our nervous system and brain. The notochord is a flexible, it starts off as flexible cartilaginous rod that offers support. Before we have a true bony skeleton, this is going to remain as cartilage. And in our diagram here, it is this red cord here. So this is eventually going to develop into things like our skeletal system. The pharyngeal gill slits. Believe it or not, even when you were a developing embryo, you had pharyngeal gill slits. It's just that while we develop, these gill slits go away. But if they're in an aquatic chordate, then a lot of these gill slits are going to remain, such as with fishes and with sharks. So the pharyngeal gill slits can be used for filter feeding. We see that in the classes Urochordata, Cephalochordata, and Agnatha. And we're going to be going over each one of these classes. They can be used for gas exchange, so this is where we see it with our fishes. And we see this with classes Chondrichthyes and Osteichthyes. These are our sharks and our fishes. And in some, they are going to be lost in the adults. So this is the case for mammals, including human beings. Our pharyngeal gill slits are lost. And finally, the last characteristic is the postanal tail. This is often only present in the embryonic stage. And again, this is true for human beings. Human beings, when we are developing, we have a postanal tail. We still even have a tail bone. It's just that as we continue development, the tail is lost. Okay, the first subphylum Urochordata. This is tunicates and sea squirts. They are marine invertebrates, so they are still considered invertebrates, but the reason why they are included in chordata is because in the larval stage, they exhibit the four characteristics that join everything into chordata. So the larval stage is free swimming. It has the four traits of chordates, the Again, the postanal tail, the pharyngeal gill slits, the notochord, and the dorsal hollow nerve cord. They do exhibit bilateral symmetry, but like with some of the other organisms that we've talked about, the larval stage really just wants to find a substrate to latch onto and then metamorphose into the adult stage. The adult stage is called a tunicate. So this is what the adult looks like, pretty different, starkly different from the larval form. The adults are sessile, so there's that word sessile again, meaning non-moving. They do not move, they do not swim. In the adult stage, the only chordate trait that they retain are the pharyngeal gill slits. So they are, here it is in our diagram of the larval stage, the gill slits, and those gill slits are going to be maintained within the body of the adult tunicate stage. So here is the differences between the adult and larval stages. So again, they look quite different from one another if you can compare and contrast these two things. So again, it's the larval stage that has all 4 of those chordate traits, and the only one that is remaining in the adult stage after metamorphosis is the pharyngeal gill slits. And those are going to be used for, pardon me, those are going to be used for filter feeding, they're going to be used for respiration, and that's the only one that persists into the adult stage. Okay, so that is the brief overview for this branch of our tree. So we are going to continue moving through evolutionary time into our next subphylum, Cephalochordata. So this means head chord. If you remember with octopods, they were in cephalopoda, which means head foot. This is Cephalochordata, which means head cord. They are burrowing marine invertebrates, so they are still considered invertebrates because they do not have true vertebra. They are mostly sessile, so they mostly do not move around, and they will bury themselves into the ocean floor. So here's a couple of them buried into the ground, and then they just have their mouth parts exposed at the top for feeding. They have low amounts of cephalization, so they don't have a true brain, but they do have some sensory systems and sensory organs located on one side of the head. Again, that is called cephalization, but they only have low amounts of cephalization. Their mouth consists of a couple of parts, the buccal cavity and tentacles, so that's going to be located up here. And they are filter feeders, so they will collect food particles with the buccal cavity and tentacles and filter that into the mouth. In this case, the adults retain chordate traits. They have the notochord, the pharyngeal gill slits, the dorsal nerve cord, and the postanal tail. But again, they're very low on the evolutionary tree of chordates, so they don't have true vertebra or a true brain yet. All right, now we're getting into some the most interesting in my opinion, but my opinion is extremely biased because I study mammals, and mammals are vertebrates. So we are in now the subphylum Vertebrata. They evolved about 530 million years ago during the Cambrian explosion, and we do see finally a true vertebral column. It has a spinal cord, and the spinal cord is going to partially replace that notochord in adults. The notochord becomes the vertebral column and invertebral discs. The dorsal hollow nerve cord is going to develop into that central nervous system, so the brain and spinal cord. And we're going to see a lot of interesting shapes and sizes of skulls, which is going to allow for extra brain space, which usually means increased intelligence. This is also going to help, having a larger skull is going to help protect the eyes, ears, and brain, so protecting those sensory systems. All right, so coming back to our cladogram here, again, this is moving up through evolutionary time, and we're going to be covering the majority of these more complicated organisms. So first we have the class Agnatha. The class Agnatha are considered jawless fishes. So this includes organisms such as the hagfish. Hagfish are marine scavengers. They have tentacles to find food on the ocean floor. So here is our hagfish, and here are the tentacles. They do not have true jaws. They just kind of have this mouth part that can latch on to things. Lampreys are freshwater ectoparasites, so they live on the outside of things. They have lots of teeth and a rasping tongue that allows them to attach to other fishes. So here at the bottom right, we have some lampreys that are parasitizing this poor fish. So they are ectoparasites. They are jawless. Unlike higher chordates, they do not have a jaw. The notochord has now developed into more of a supportive rod, and it's composed of cartilage, so flexible cartilage, but not a true vertebral column yet. They have that cartilaginous endoskeleton. So that endoskeleton is the precursor to a true bony skeleton. And they are separated from other fishes because they don't have some characteristics like our other fishes have, such as paired appendages, so fins on either side. They don't have a structure called the lateral line, which is like a sixth sense for our sharks and fishes, and they have a less of a developed sensory system. All right, so now we have just covered this branch of our evolutionary tree. So we are going to continue up this way. We're not going to go over this guy. Instead, we're going to go right into our next into our more highly developed types of fishes. The first class is chondrichthyes. These are sharks and skates and rays. So, class chondrichthyes. So the class chondrichthyes, again, includes probably the most recognizable one are going to be sharks and things like stingrays and manta rays. They are marine predators and marine scavengers, so they are found in saltwater ecosystems. They do have a large, powerful jaw. This is the first true jaw that we see. So if I ever ask a test question like, which class of vertebrates was the first to develop a true jaw? Well, your answer would be the class chondrichthyes. And you can remember that because there is literally an entire movie dedicated to the fact that this class has jaws. They still have a cartilaginous endoskeleton, so it's not a true bony skeleton, it's cartilage. They do have paired appendages, so they have a fin over here and a fin over there, a fin here and a fin on the other side, so paired appendages. They do have a structure called a lateral line. On this diagram here, that lateral line runs laterally down the body. So if you follow my cursor here, this red line is the lateral line, and it acts as a sixth sense. They can sense pressure changes in the water, and some sharks can even sense electromagnetic changes. They have a heterocircle tail. Hetero means different. Heterocircle tail means that the top of the fin and the bottom of the fin are different lengths. So the top of the fin is longer than the bottom of the fin. So it's different. So it's called heterocircle. So a heterocircle tail. Now I put on here no swim bladder or operculum. I put this as they don't have it because this is separating them from the next class we'll talk about, the class Osteichthyes. And I'll go into more detail of what the swim bladder and the operculum do as a function. But because they do not have these structures, they most of the time have to constantly swim. So if they had a swim bladder and an operculum, they could stay in one position and still be able to breathe. But because they lack those structures, they have to swim constantly and maintain a vertical position. Otherwise, they can literally pass out from lack of oxygen. They have gills and denticles. Denticles are very, very fine scales. So if you've ever been to an aquarium where they had those stingray petting areas, or like the ray petting areas, and you had the opportunity to do that, you would notice that they have more of like a leathery feel, not really like a fish scale. But they do have scales. They still have scales. They're just so small and microscopic and fit so snugly together that it feels almost like a leather rather than scales. And with sharks we actually see internal fertilization. So males and females will breed, and it's internal fertilization. So sperm enters the body of the female, and the eggs are fertilized within the body of the female. Some sharks will even give live birth. All right, so now we have gone up this branch of our cladogram, and we're going to continue moving upward into our next class, the class for bony fishes, or osteichthyes. So chordata, class osteichthyes, bony fishes. If you want to remember the name, the class osteichthyes, if you think about a bone disorder where bone mass starts to decrease, is called osteoporosis. It's very common in older women. So osteoporosis is referring to the bones. So osteichthyes is referring to bony fish. This is the most diverse class in the subphylum Vertebrata. They dominate most aquatic communities, including freshwater, marine ecosystems. You can find them in ponds, lakes, creeks, rivers, oceans, seas. There are fishes absolutely everywhere. Some derived traits for the class. We see our first true bony skeleton. And unlike the class Chondrichthyes, they do have an operculum. This operculum is a small structure that acts as a pump. It's a gill covering that pumps water over the gills, and so that they can stay still and still get oxygen using that pump to have water pass over the gills. The swim bladder allows them to also stay in place. It provides a source of buoyancy and balance with little to no muscle effort. Some ancestral traits with respect to sharks. We do still have a true jaw, we still have a lateral line, and we still have paired fins. But unlike our sharks that had a heterocircle tail, our fishes have homocircle tails. So the top of the fin and the bottom of the fin are going to be equal in length. So this is a homocircle tail. All right, so how did the first animals move on to land? So we have ray-finned fishes. So these are ray-finned fishes down here. And some ray-finned fishes actually start to have bone, thicker bone that goes into the fin. So ray-finned fishes don't have bones in the fins, and this does consist of the majority of fish. But we had the evolution of some lobe-finned fishes. So here's the first lobe-finned fish, and this is when the bones start to go into the fins, and they can start kind of pulling themselves up onto land. So this eventually, over the evolution of millions of years, will eventually become 4 walking legs. The gills are eventually going to develop into a lung sac, and then we're going to have the evolution of our first tetrapods. We still have lobe-finned fishes today. One of my favorites is this little guy here called a mud skipper. Mud skippers do live in the water, but they can drag themselves up onto land, and that's where they give their breeding and mating displays, is on land, and so they'll drag themselves up. Oh yeah, so there's our mud skippers. So these are 2 males fighting right here. And they are on land, and they can keep themselves moist in the mud, and they will eventually return to water. But this is just, it's evolutionary evidence that fishes do have the capability of dragging themselves up onto land and doing complex behaviors.